Good morning and welcome to our live coverage of the launch of another batch of Starlink satellites from the Kennedy Space Center. SpaceX is preparing a Falcon 9 rocket for blastoff at 9:38 a.m. Eastern Daylight Time. This will be SpaceX's 33rd launch of the year.
Good morning. You're looking live at Launch Complex 39A at the Kennedy Space Center in Florida, where SpaceX is counting down to liftoff of the Falcon 9 rocket this morning at 9:38 a.m. Eastern Time, 13:38 UTC. This mission will be carrying 53 more Starlink internet satellites into orbit. This is the 53rd dedicated launch for the Starlink network, and this will mark the 33rd Falcon 9 launch of the year. Liftoff now 53 minutes away. SpaceX engineers stationed in Firing Room 4 of the Launch Control Center at the Kennedy Space Center are preparing to begin loading propellants into the Falcon 9 rocket this morning. That propellant loading will begin at T-minus 35 minutes, a little more than 17 minutes away. Before then, we expect to hear the conclusion and the outcome of the pre-launch readiness check of SpaceX's launch team, verifying that all stations are go for a launch attempt this morning at 9:38 a.m. Eastern Time. Now T-minus 45 minutes and counting. You're looking now live from our vantage point at the Kennedy Space Center press site, looking out toward the east at Launch Complex 39A, where the Falcon 9 rocket is now less than 45 minutes from liftoff with the next batch of 53 Starlink Internet satellites. The Falcon 9 rocket out at Pad 39A stands 229 feet or 70 meters in height. In this view, you can see the launch vehicle vertical to the right of the rocket itself is the strong back structure. That mast-like structure is also part of the transporter erector system that actually transported the Falcon 9 rocket from its hangar to Launch Complex 39A back on Friday, and then raised it vertical overnight Friday into Saturday for a static fire test yesterday morning at 9 a.m. Eastern Time, about 24 hours ago. That static fire test at 9 a.m. yesterday involved the ignition of the 9 Merlin 1D engines on the bottom of the first stage for approximately 7 seconds while clamps held the Falcon 9 firmly onto the ground. This is a test firing to ensure that the rocket and ground systems are all ready to go. These static fire tests have become more of a rarity of late in SpaceX launch operations. They were once a customary part of every Falcon 9 launch campaign up until 2020. Every single Falcon 9 launch included a pre-launch static fire test on the pad. But SpaceX has now begun phasing those static fire tests out for most missions as the Falcon 9 launch cadence ramps up. As these launches become more regular and at a faster cadence, the static fire tests are no longer necessary, SpaceX feels, to maintain a reliable launch on time and a reliable launch service for the Falcon 9 rocket. According to some recent reporting from Aviation Week and Space Technology, SpaceX now only performs static fire tests on boosters that have had at least 3 engines removed in between flights. So we're not sure if 100% sure if that was the case for this particular booster, which most recently flew back in June. But we do know, according to Aviation Week, in a report last month, that SpaceX has gone from requiring a static fire test on a booster after changing 1 engine to relaxing those requirements down now to only require a test firing on the pad when 3 engines are removed. 3 of the 9 engines on the first stage are removed between flights. This booster is booster number 1062. It's going for its 8th flight today. At this time, the launch team in firing room 4 of the Launch Control Center at Kennedy Space Center should be going through their electronic poll for their readiness to enter the terminal phase of the countdown, which begins at T-minus 35 minutes. We expect to hear confirmation from the SpaceX launch director in a few minutes' time on the outcome of that poll to verify all parameters are acceptable for proceeding into the propellant loading operation and launch. Now 38 minutes to launch. Here's a replay of the static fire test yesterday that I was talking about earlier in my commentary. You can see here the engine plume coming out of the north end of the flame trench at pad 39A as those 9 Merlin engines ignited for about 7 seconds on the pad. This static fire test with this particular rocket occurred at 9 a.m. yesterday, almost exactly to the minute 24 hours ago, in preparation for today's launch opportunity. The 9 Merlin engines powered up to full throttle, producing about 1.7 million pounds of thrust as sensors and data gauges on board the rocket gathered information on the performance of those engines for analysis by SpaceX engineers who have now cleared the rocket for launch today. Now 3 minutes left until the expected start time for propellant loading for this morning's launch opportunity for the Falcon 9 rocket. Now 37.5 minutes to go until liftoff. SpaceX's countdown clock is just past the T-minus 35-minute point. This is the expected start time for propellant loading. We would normally be bringing you mission audio provided by SpaceX of the callouts from the launch control team. But right now, SpaceX's mission audio feed is not active. We're not sure if this is a glitch with their YouTube stream or an issue with the launch itself this morning. No indication otherwise of the launch being delayed at this point, with everything appearing to be on track for liftoff at 9:38 a.m. Eastern Time. Even if we don't get those audio callouts in the next few minutes, we do expect to see confirmation, visual confirmation, that propellant loading has started as we see some of the frost buildup on the first stage booster. That's from the cryogenic liquid oxygen that will be loaded into the first stage, causing ice and frost to build up on that dark airframe of the first stage booster. So we expect to see that really just in a couple of minutes. We should see visual confirmation whether propellant loading has indeed started. Now T-minus 30 minutes and 45 seconds. We are seeing the first hints of frost and vapors outside on the outer skin of the first stage booster, indicating that propellant loading did indeed begin at T-minus 35 minutes. So all looks to be on schedule for liftoff at 9:38 a.m. Eastern Time. For those of you keeping precise records, liftoff is scheduled for 9:38:20 a.m. Eastern Time, or 13:38:20 UTC.
Well, we are configured for launch. Do you want to do the slides, Cindy?
We start at T-minus 28 with the first three.
Okay, we'll do that. Doing the Starlink slides, right?
Yes, the first three Starlink slides, and we could do also the countdown timeline if you want.
Does that come after those slides?
Yep, it's the next in order. Yep.
Okay, just cue me when you want me to move on.
Copy. I'm ready for the first one now. Now T-minus 27 minutes and 37 seconds. Today's mission is carrying 53 Starlink internet satellites into orbit. This will mark the 53rd dedicated Falcon 9 launch for the Starlink network. And SpaceX has launched more than 2,900 Starlink satellites already to date, and adding 53 more today. On the left-hand side of your screen, this is a file photo from a previous mission showing what the 53 Starlink satellites look like as they're flat packed inside the payload fairing of the Falcon 9 rocket. In this photo, you can see those satellites stacked one on top of the other, held down by retention rods that actually keep the satellites firmly attached to the second stage of the Falcon 9 during the climb to space. And in the background, in this particular view, inside a clean room, a processing facility, you can see one half of a Falcon 9 payload fairing moving into position to encapsulate this stack of Starlink satellites. So this is what the stack of Starlink satellites look like in launch configuration out on pad 39A, now 26 and a half minutes until liftoff. There are 53 spacecraft, as I've mentioned, on board. Each one of these spacecraft weighs a little more than a quarter ton, between 250 and 300 kilograms or so. They are a solar-powered spacecraft, so once they deploy off the top of the Falcon 9 rocket about 15 minutes after liftoff, they will deploy their solar panels and activate ion engines to maneuver into a higher orbit. They're going to be dropped off in an orbit about 200 miles or so above the Earth, and then maneuver into an orbit about 335 miles or 540 kilometers in altitude in the coming weeks and months. SpaceX builds these satellites on an assembly line up in Redmond, Washington, which is the home base for the Starlink program. This is what a user terminal looks like for the Starlink network. So SpaceX consumers, Starlink consumers can sign up for the Starlink service by going to starlink.com and paying a fee to order one of these antennas, a one-time fee, and then paying a monthly subscription fee for access to the low latency broadband service provided by these Starlink satellites. At last report, SpaceX said the Starlink service was currently available in 36 countries around the world, with plans to add more countries in the coming weeks and months. Now, T-minus 25 minutes and counting. Here's an overview of the countdown this morning. We've already passed several of these milestones. At T-minus 35 minutes, the loading of propellants into the first stage began, as well as loading of kerosene into the second stage that also began at T-minus 35 minutes. Looking ahead later on in the countdown, the next major milestone will be at about T-minus 20 minutes. That will be the confirmation of the second stage having been fully loaded with kerosene fuel. At T-minus 16 minutes, the second stage will begin loading liquid oxygen into that will be the last of the 4 propellant tanks to be loaded this morning during the countdown. At T-minus 7 minutes, the Merlin 1D engines on the bottom of the first stage, 9 of them, will begin their chill down procedure. This is a process to thermally condition the engines for ignition by flowing small amounts of super cold propellant through some of the plumbing and pipes leading into those engines to condition that hardware and those components for the shock of the more rapid flow of propellant at engine start. At about T-minus 5 minutes and 30 seconds, the Falcon 9 should be fully loaded with kerosene at that time. The first stage should be full at that time. The second stage should be full at T-minus 20 minutes. Liquid oxygen loading will continue down until about T-minus 2 minutes. And at that point, the propellant loading process will be secured and terminated. At T-minus 1 minute, the Falcon 9's onboard computer will take command of the countdown. At T-minus 45 seconds, SpaceX's launch director will verify their final go for launch. And in that final minute or so of the countdown, the propellant tanks will be brought up to flight pressure. And then at T-minus 3 seconds, the engine controller will command engine start on all 9 engines. And a computer-controlled health check, an automated health check of each of those 9 engines will be completed in the last couple of seconds of the countdown, leading up to the release of the hold-down clamps at the bottom of the rocket, allowing the Falcon 9 to begin its climb to space when the clock strikes 0. Now, T-minus 22 minutes and 40 seconds. Again, the next major milestone in the countdown this morning will be in about 2 minutes or so, when we should see confirmation or hear confirmation that the kerosene tank on the second stage is full. That's the first of the 4 propellant tanks that'll be fully loaded during this countdown. We'll also see the so-called big vent of gaseous oxygen coming from the strong bank just to the right of the rocket. And that will mark the start of the chill down of transfer lines, the liquid oxygen transfer lines leading up that strong back structure in preparation for loading of the cryogenic oxidizer into the second stage at T-minus 16 minutes. Now, T-minus 20 minutes and 12 seconds, you're now seeing that big vent. This is the point in the countdown that the chill down of the liquid oxygen transfer lines leading up the length or height of that strong back mass next to the rocket begins. This is a thermal conditioning of those transfer lines in preparation for the flow of liquid oxygen chilled down to several hundred degrees below zero into the second stage, beginning at T-minus 16 minutes. Also, at this point in the countdown, the second stage should be fully loaded with kerosene fuel. However, we're not hearing mission audio updates from SpaceX's launch control team as we typically do. There appears to be some sort of a glitch in the stream that SpaceX provides to us of the countdown audio. We hope to get that before launch time, so we'll stand by for that. However, we can report that the countdown is continuing and proceeding on schedule. 19 minutes to go until liftoff of the Falcon 9 on the Starlink 4-25 mission with 53 Starlink internet satellites on board. While we wait for the launch opportunity this morning at 9:38 a.m. Eastern Time, we invite you to join our YouTube channel. You can also contribute to our coverage through joining our YouTube channel and also through the Super Chat function on YouTube. And any contribution you provide to us through these methods really helps us bring you live coverage like what you're watching right now of the Falcon 9 counting down to liftoff from the Kennedy Space Center. We also welcome you and invite you to like our stream as we continue our coverage now, 18 minutes, 15 seconds until liftoff. We just heard confirmation now from SpaceX Launch Control that the Stage 2 liquid oxygen load has started. So this is the last of the 4 propellant tanks to be filled this morning. The second stage kerosene tank is already fully loaded, and kerosene and liquid oxygen loading, fuel and oxidizer loading onto Stage 1 continues. Less than 16 minutes to go. Now T-minus 14 minutes and 15 seconds. Here are some mission stats for today's Falcon 9 flight. This will be the 167th launch of a Falcon 9 rocket since 2010, since that first Falcon 9 test flight back on June the 4th of 2010 from Pad 40 over at Cape Canaveral Space Force Station. This is the 175th launch of a Falcon rocket overall since 2006. This includes the 5 flights of the Falcon 1 rocket, SpaceX's first orbital class launch vehicle, as well as 3 flights of the Falcon Heavy. This booster is tail number 1062. It's the 8th flight of this reusable rocket booster. It's the 144th Falcon 9 launch from Florida. It's the 52nd SpaceX launch from Launch Complex 39A, and the 146th launch overall from Pad 39A, including Falcon 9s, Falcon Heavies from SpaceX, as well as space shuttle launches and launches of the Saturn V moon rocket in the Apollo program of the 1960s and 70s. So obviously a very historic pad at the Kennedy Space Center, seeing its 146th launch today. This will be the 109th flight of a Falcon 9 rocket to utilize a recycled booster. It's also the 53rd dedicated Falcon 9 launch for the Starlink internet network. It's the 33rd Falcon 9 launch of the year. SpaceX's most recent launch back on Friday, just 2 days ago from California, broke the company's annual launch record of 31 missions that was set just last year. So SpaceX is extending that record today with 33, the 33rd Falcon 9 launch of the year. And it's also the 32nd orbital launch attempt from Cape Canaveral in 2022. That's also a record, breaking 31 orbital launch attempts back in last year from Cape Canaveral, as well as in 1966. So 31 orbital launch attempts in 1966 and 2021. Today is number 32, breaking that long-standing record that goes all the way back to 1966. Now T-minus 12 minutes and counting. Everything continues to look good for launch of the Falcon 9 rocket from the Kennedy Space Center at 9:38 a.m. Eastern Time, 13:38 UTC. As I mentioned, this is the 8th flight of the Falcon 9 booster number 1062. This rocket debuted on November the 5th, 2020 with the launch of a U.S. Space Force GPS navigation satellite. It launched another GPS satellite about 7 months later on June 17th of last year. And then more recently, it launched the all-private Inspiration 4 crew mission last September. It launched a Starlink mission in January. It launched the commercial Axiom 1 flight carrying 4 commercial astronauts to the International Space Station back on April the 8th. It launched another Starlink mission on April the 29th from Pad 40 at Cape Canaveral. And then most recently, it launched on June the 8th from Pad 40 once again with the Egyptian Nilesat 301 geostationary communication satellite. So flight number 8 for this booster going today, booster number 1062, on the pad at Pad 39A, awaiting liftoff in 10.5 minutes. You can see some of the photographers and spectators gathering at the Kennedy Space Center press site for this morning's launch. T-minus 9 minutes and counting. This map shows the expected trajectory and ground track of the Falcon 9 rocket as it heads downrange this morning from the Kennedy Space Center. The red line shows its track out over the Atlantic Ocean, flying northeast to roughly parallel to the U.S. East Coast. Also labeled here are the locations of Launch Complex 39A and the location of SpaceX's drone ship, a shortfall of Gravitas, located about 400 miles or 650 kilometers northeast of the Cape. Also, that's roughly due east of Charleston, South Carolina. That's the location of this football field size drone ship that the Falcon 9 booster will target landing on about 8.5 minutes after liftoff. Here's an overview of the major milestones expected after liftoff today. The Falcon 9 rocket will exceed the speed of sound in less than a minute. And the first stage, as typical for a Falcon 9 launch profile, will shut down about 2.5 minutes after launch. It'll separate from the second stage and then begin its descent back toward the drone ship in the Atlantic Ocean. Meanwhile, the second stage will ignite its Merlin vacuum engine. It'll jettison the payload fairing a few moments later, and then it'll head into orbit for a 6-minute burn to place these 53 Starlink internet satellites into orbit. Meanwhile, the first stage will perform an entry burn to slow down as it dives back into the atmosphere with 3 of its engines. Then it'll reignite one engine for a final landing burn, and will extend its landing legs and then touch down in the drone ship at about the same time, just a few seconds separating the landing of the first stage and the orbital injection of the second stage. And then the separation of the 53 Starlink satellites is expected about 15 minutes and 24 seconds after liftoff. This graphic from SpaceX shows some of the major maneuvers during the launch. As the Falcon 9 heads downrange, you can see the first stage separating from the second stage at that stage separation marker in this graphic. And the first stage performs a flip maneuver using coal gas nitrogen thrusters to reorient itself into a tail first configuration. It'll extend those titanium grid fins for stability as it re-enters the atmosphere, performs an entry burn, and then a final landing burn before landing on the drone ship. And all that happening while the second stage, as an independent vehicle, continues into orbit with the 53 Starlink satellites on board.
Stage 1 RP1 load is complete.
Now approaching T-minus 5 minutes. In the last couple of minutes, we've heard confirmation that the chill down of the first stage's engines began at T-minus 7 minutes. We've also heard confirmation that the first stage RP1 tank or kerosene tank has been fully loaded. So now about 46,000 gallons of kerosene has been pumped into the Falcon 9 rocket.
Falcon 9
Liquid
tank
oxygen loading
for strong back
continues down to about T-minus 2 minutes. The next major milestone will be the retraction of the strong back structure, that mast to the right of the Falcon 9. That will be moved back to an angle of about 1.5 degrees from the vehicle.
Strong back retract has started.
Strong back retraction has now gotten underway and is actually nearing completion at this point. That began with the opening of clamps that wrapped around the upper stage of the Falcon 9 rocket, and then that strong back moved back to an angle of about 1.5 degrees from the Falcon 9. You can see, if you look closely, it's still in motion, moving back to its pre-ignition position. At engine start and liftoff, the strong back will actually retract much more rapidly to an angle, a steeper angle, farther away from the Falcon 9 rocket to clear the way for the launch vehicle to begin its vertical climb.
Stage 1 LOX load is complete. And Stage 1 POGO.
T-minus 2 minutes and counting. T-minus 1 minute, 40 seconds.
Stage 2 LOX load is complete.
And there's the final call out that the stage 2 liquid oxygen load is complete. We heard stage 1 liquid oxygen loading was finished about a minute or so ago. So SpaceX now has a fully fueled, fully loaded Falcon 9 on pad 39A, weighs about 1.2 million pounds. 1 million pounds of that is propellant.
Ground gas closeouts has started.
See the water tower to the left of the pad now dumping some water. This is sometimes happens during the final phase of the countdown. That water tower holds thousands of gallons of water that will be dumped onto the pad deck in the final seconds of the countdown to suppress the acoustic energy, the noise
Falcon 9 is in startup.
from the Falcon 9's engines at liftoff. T-minus 45 seconds. The Falcon 9's onboard computer now controlling the countdown at this point. T-minus 35 seconds.
LD, go for launch.
There's the final call from the launch director. SpaceX's launch director is go for launch. T-minus 25 seconds. T-minus 20.
T-minus
The engine
30
startup
seconds.
sequence should begin at T-minus 3 seconds. T-minus 8, 7, 6, 5, 4,
T-minus 15
3,
seconds.
2, 1.
10, 9, 8, 7, 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, 0. Ignition.
And there's ignition
And liftoff.
and liftoff of the Falcon 9 rocket carrying 53 Starlink internet satellites into orbit. This is SpaceX's
Vehicle
sixth
is
launch
pitching
in
downrange.
17 days. 9 Merlin
Stage
engines
1 chamber
powering the
pressures are
Falcon
nominal.
9 off the pad, heading to the northeast from the Kennedy Space Center.
Alcohol power and telemetry. Falcon 9 is supersonic. Max Q.
We've heard confirmation now that the Falcon 9 has exceeded the speed of sound. Those 9 Merlin engines continue powering the vehicle downrange. Everything looking good so far. A minute,
MVAC
45
engine chill
seconds
has
into the
started.
flight. Now 2 minutes into the flight. And there is visual confirmation of main engine cutoff.
Main engine cutoff. Stage separation confirmed.
Staging has been confirmed. First and second stages have separated.
MVAC ignition.
And there's the call out that the second stage
Fairing separation confirmed.
has ignited its Merlin vacuum engine. And the payload fairing has jettisoned.
Acquisition of signal, Bermuda.
We've now switched to a SpaceX's onboard camera feed. On the left-hand side of your screen, you can see a view from the first stage with its 4 titanium grid fins extended. On the right, the upper stage firing its Merlin vacuum engine into orbit. Now more than 4 minutes since launch, the upper stage just passing 10,000 kilometers per hour velocity at an altitude of 165 kilometers. It's about 110 miles or so. This map shows the locations of stage 1 and stage 2 as they're now flying on their independent trajectories. Stage 1 heading on that arcing ballistic trajectory toward the drone ship. The second stage continuing to fire into orbit with the 53 Starlink satellites.
Both stages are following nominal trajectories.
Looking good, approaching 6 minutes since launch. The upper stage now accelerating past 13,000 kilometers per hour. Now less than a minute remaining until the entry burn on the first stage, which you'll see on the left-hand side of your screen. You'll see that engine plume light up. 3 engines will be used to perform this entry burn, a braking maneuver to slow the rocket down as it plunges deeper into the atmosphere, heading for landing on the drone ship in the Atlantic Ocean.
Stage 1 FTS is safe.
Stage 1 entry burn startup.
We've heard verbal confirmation now of entry burn startup. We expect to see that visually in a few moments. The video feed from the rocket sometimes does have a lag of a few seconds. There's entry burn startup.
Entry burn shutdown.
And now we've heard confirmation that the entry burn is complete. We'll
Both
see that
to follow nominal trajectories.
completed on the camera view shortly. And there's entry burn complete. This booster heading for the drone ship, a shortfall of gravitas, parked about 400 miles or 650 kilometers downrange from the Kennedy Space Center. It's going to be dipping through those clouds in the next few moments.
Stage 1 transonic. Terminal guidance. Stage 1 landing burn. Stage 1 landing leg deploy.
There you see the drone ship coming into view. Landing burn underway. The center engine on the booster is firing to slow the rocket down for landing.
MVAC shutdown.
Acquisition of signal, Newfoundland.
Nominal orbit insertion.
Spectacular view there of the booster landing on the drone ship, completing its 8th trip to space. 8 flights now in the logbook for booster number 1062. We also heard confirmation of SECO, second stage engine cutoff, and a nominal orbit insertion. So the 53 Starlink satellites still attached to stage 2 are now in their expected orbit. About 6 minutes left until Starlink separation, until these satellites actually deploy from the upper stage of the Falcon 9. That'll be the last major milestone other than a deorbit burn after separation for the upper stage for this mission. So a great start to SpaceX's 33rd flight of the year. We'll stand by for a few more minutes to await confirmation of Starlink separation. That separation event is scheduled for T plus 15 minutes and 24 seconds, although that separation may occur while the upper stage is outside of communications range with the ground station. So it may be a few minutes after that before SpaceX can confirm that the deployment went off without a hitch. Now T plus 12 minutes and 39 seconds. SpaceX has ended their live video coverage of today's mission, but they're still providing us this tracking map.
Expected loss of signal, Bermuda.
And we expect to continue to have this map as well as audio callouts from the launch control team up until the confirmation of Starlink separation. We just heard that the upper stage has passed outside of the tracking station range, the range of the tracking station in Bermuda. The next tracking station that is expected to pick up the signal from the second stage is over in the United Kingdom. Now less than a minute and a half to go until the expected time of Starlink separation when these 53 satellites are released from the Falcon 9's upper stage in orbit. But there may be a bit of a delay this morning to hear confirmation of that. Wait until the upper stage is back in range of a ground station over the UK.
Payload separation confirmed.
And SpaceX, if you heard that call out, has confirmed payload deployment. So the 53 Starlink Internet satellites are now flying free of their Falcon 9 rocket after arriving in orbit this morning following an on-time launch at 9:38 a.m. Eastern Time from Launch Complex 39A at the Kennedy Space Center in Florida. Another seemingly picture-perfect launch for SpaceX. Launch number 33 of the year, now in the books.
Goonhilly.
And we just heard a call out that the upper stage
signal, Newfoundland.
is now in range of that UK ground station in Goonhilly, which is actually celebrating their 60th anniversary this month. Just a point of correction and clarification. The time of at the time of payload separation, when the Starlink satellites separated from the Falcon 9 upper stage, the upper stage was actually in range of a ground station in Newfoundland. because we just heard that call out that the upper stage is now out of range of that ground station. So the signals confirming payload deployment were apparently routed through that ground station in Newfoundland to SpaceX launch control. So there was not any gap in communications at the time of payload separation. Now you're looking live once more at Launch Complex 39A, where the Falcon 9 took off 18 minutes ago at 9:38 a.m. Eastern Time, or 13:38 UTC. The exact launch time, for those of you who keep records on this, was at 9:38:20, 9:38 a.m. and 20 seconds Eastern Time, 13:38:20 UTC. If you're looking out at Launch Complex 39A, and it looks a little different than the last time you saw it, that's because SpaceX is continuing to build out the launch gantry tower for the next generation Super Heavy and Starship program. That's just to the right of the Falcon 9 launch pedestal in this view, with that large crane next to it. 4 of 9 tower segments for the Starship pad are now in place. A 5th tower segment is expected to roll out to pad 39A sometime next week for stacking, and that'll mark the it'll put the tower over the halfway point to its eventual total height that'll be standing more than 450 feet tall, becoming one of the tallest structures at the spaceport in Florida, second only to the Vehicle Assembly Building, NASA's historic, iconic VAB, used initially for the Apollo program, built up in the 1960s. That stands 525 feet tall. Before we sign off, we want to invite you to, of course, join our YouTube channel to make sure you don't miss any coverage of any launch or any other operations going on at the Kennedy Space Center or Cape Canaveral Space Force Station. We also occasionally and regularly post video features on our YouTube channel, and the highlights of major activities, launches, and other activities at Cape Canaveral are also available on our YouTube channel. And of course, if you join our YouTube channel, at any contributions that we receive through that go toward helping us continue and expand our coverage of the space industry. You can also contribute to us via the Super Chat function on our YouTube chat on our stream. And of course, if you join our YouTube channel, you'll gain access to some exclusive videos as well. So there's a benefit to joining our YouTube channel, and we'll hope you consider that. Now 23 minutes since the launch of the Falcon 9 rocket. And we do thank all of you who have contributed either in Super Chat or become a member of our YouTube channel. As I mentioned, this goes a long way to helping us continue to bring you live coverage of events like today's launch here at Cape Canaveral, Florida, and at the Kennedy Space Center. Looking ahead, here's what's next on our calendar. Currently, there are no launches planned, at least in the United States, next week. But August will get off with a busy period of launches beginning on August the 2nd, when SpaceX's next mission is scheduled to launch from Space Launch Complex 40 at Cape Canaveral Space Force Station. This will be carrying the Korean Pathfinder Lunar Orbiter mission, a South Korean lunar probe. This is South Korea's first space exploration mission. It carries a suite of instruments from Korean institutions as well as from NASA, and will be heading off on a multi-month journey, a low-energy ballistic transfer to the moon, arriving at the moon in the December timeframe to begin its survey of the lunar surface and the lunar exosphere. That will be followed on August the 4th, 2 days later, by the next United Launch Alliance mission, also from here on the Space Coast of Florida. This will be carrying the SBIRS GEO-6 missile warning satellite. This is actually the last satellite in the SBIRS program, the space-based infrared system that provides advanced warning of ballistic missile launches around the world for the United States Space Force. And then on August the 9th, another Falcon 9 rocket will be scheduled for launch with another batch of Starlink Internet satellites from Launch Complex 39A at the Kennedy Space Center, the same pad we saw in action this morning. Also, sometime in early August, we don't have a definitive target date right now. SpaceX's next launch from Vandenberg Space Force Base will be carrying another 46 Starlink satellites into polar orbit, a different orbital plane than the missions that launch from here in Florida. So that mission is also scheduled for the early August timeframe. So 4 launches from SpaceX and United Launch Alliance planned in the first week to week and a half or so of August. And of course, later on in August is the current no earlier than target date for NASA's Artemis 1 mission to the moon. That launch is scheduled for no earlier than August 29th. And if that schedule holds, the rollout of the Space Launch System moon rocket, the first Space Launch System moon rocket, is targeted for no earlier than August the 18th from the Vehicle Assembly Building at the Kennedy Space Center. And so that's another major thing we'll be covering throughout the month of August and perhaps into September as NASA ramps up for this long-awaited, long-delayed, and much anticipated test flight of the Space Launch System moon rocket and the Orion spacecraft to the moon, setting the stage for future crew missions to the moon on these vehicles. And of course, next week, as I mentioned a few minutes ago, we expect to see the next segment of the Starship Tower head out to Launch Complex 39A, the 5th of 9 segments. That rollout of this tower segment is currently targeted for no earlier than tomorrow night, but we're not yet 100% sure on whether that schedule is holding or if it's going to be later in the week. This is a 7-mile transfer from SpaceX's Roberts Road facility to the southwest of the Vehicle Assembly Building along roads heading out to pad 39A. And then once at the pad, that crane you see to the right of the Starship gantry structure will be lifting that segment on top of the 4 segments already in place. We'll be covering that rollout, that tower segment transfer, live when it happens. So now 27 and a half minutes since today's Starlink launch from the Kennedy Space Center. We're going to go ahead and conclude our live commentary. Check back later today for a full recap story on spaceflightnow.com and continuing coverage of other events across the wider space industry in the coming days ahead. So until next time, I'm Stephen Clark reporting live. Thanks for joining us. Have a great rest of your day.